Sometimes the greatest courage isn't drawing your gun, it's keeping it holstered. In a world that's forgotten patience and trust, one forgotten man remembers. When a wild stallion named Diablo tears through a frontier town, chaos erupts. Men reach for rifles, women grab children, everyone scatters. But one aging cowboy stands perfectly still. Silas Croft, a horse whisperer the town dismissed as yesterday's news, sees what no one else can: a terrified animal in pain, not a monster. While everyone screams for the horse to be shot, Silas walks forward with nothing but calm and an open hand. What happens next will change everything this town believes about strength and redemption. Could one old man's compassion turn a legend into a miracle? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Redemption Flats sat in a valley where the sage met the sky, a collection of weathered buildings that had survived 30 years of drought, flood, and the slow exodus of young people seeking easier lives elsewhere. The main street ran straight as a rifle shot from the old livery stable on the north end to the whitewashed church on the south end, with everything that mattered to frontier life arranged in between. The general store, the blacksmith's forge, the saloon with its faded paint, and Doc Henley's office all faced each other across a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and to dust when it didn't. Silas Croft had lived on the edge of this town for more than 40 years, in a small cabin backed up against the foothills where the ponderosa pines began their climb toward the mountains. He was 73 years old now, with hands that had gentled more horses than most men had ever seen, and a face carved by sun and wind into something timeless. His hair, once dark as coal, had gone silver white, but his eyes remained sharp and clear, the pale blue of winter sky. Most folks in Redemption Flats had forgotten what Silas used to be. They saw only what he was now: an old man who kept to himself, who walked into town once a week for supplies and spoke no more than necessary, who had buried his wife Margaret 15 years back and never remarried. They didn't remember the young man who could read a horse's soul through its eyes, who could calm the wildest mustang with nothing but patience and a gentle hand. They didn't remember how ranchers from 3 territories used to bring their problem horses to Silas Croft, how he'd work with them in the round pen behind his cabin, moving like he was dancing with the animal, speaking in a language only horses understood. That was before Margaret got sick, before the long months of watching her fade, of holding her hand through the pain, of learning that some things even the strongest love cannot fix. After she passed, something in Silas went quiet, not broken, exactly, but turned inward. He stopped taking on horses. He sold off his string except for one old mare named Patience, who was now 27 and spent her days grazing in the small meadow behind his cabin. The town had moved on without him. New people arrived who didn't know his reputation. The younger generation saw only an old man with a limp from an ancient injury and hands that trembled slightly when he held his coffee cup. They were polite enough, nodding when they passed him on the street, but their eyes slid past him, the way eyes slide past anything that reminds them of their own mortality. On the northern edge of town, where the road turned toward the mining camps in the high country, a man named Cyrus Blackwood had set up operation. Blackwood was a horsebreaker of the old brutal school, the kind who believed that a horse's spirit had to be shattered before it could be useful. He'd come to Redemption Flats 6 months earlier with a reputation and a contract to supply broken horses to the army fort 2 days' ride west. His corrals were built strong, his methods were harsh, and his business was good. Silas had seen Blackwood in town a few times, had noted the man's thick shoulders and hard eyes, the way he carried a quirt looped on his belt like some men carried a gun. He'd heard the sounds that came from Blackwood's corrals sometimes, when the wind was right, the screaming of horses, the crack of whips, the shouting of men who thought fear and pain were the same as respect. It made something old and angry stir in Silas's chest, but he was long past the age of telling other men how to live their lives. The world had always had men like Blackwood. It always would. What Silas didn't know, what nobody in Redemption Flats knew yet, was that 3 days earlier, Blackwood had acquired something special. A legend, a ghost story, made flesh. The stallion they called Diablo had roamed the high desert country for 8 years. A black horse with a white star on his forehead and a bloodline that went back to the Spanish horses that had run wild in these territories for generations. He was famous among the ranchers and cowboys who worked this country, a symbol of something untamed and untamable. Men had tried to catch him before. 2 had died in the attempt, thrown from their horses during the chase, necks broken in falls. The stallion himself bore scars from these encounters, rope burns on his neck, a notch torn from his left ear, and a long white mark across his shoulder where someone's bullet had grazed him years ago. Blackwood had tracked the stallion for 3 weeks, studying his patterns, learning his territory. He'd brought in 6 riders and set up a trap in a box canyon where the stallion liked to water. They'd driven him hard, run him to exhaustion, and finally roped him when he was too tired to fight effectively. Getting him back to the corrals had taken 2 days and cost Blackwood a broken finger and one of his men a concussion. But he had him now, locked in the strongest pen, and Blackwood was already counting the money he'd make when he broke this legend and sold him to some rich eastern buyer who wanted to say he owned the famous Diablo. The morning, everything changed, started ordinary enough. Silas woke before dawn as he always did, his body clock still set to rancher's hours, even though he hadn't worked livestock in years. He made coffee on his small stove, strong and black, and took it out to his porch to watch the sun come up over the mountains. Patience wandered over from the meadow, and he gave her an apple from the basket he kept by the door, running his hand along her neck while she crunched it contentedly. The old mare had been Margaret's horse, a gentle soul who'd carried his wife on her last rides before the sickness made riding impossible. Silas talked to Patience sometimes, told her about his day, shared thoughts he shared with no one else. The horse would swivel her ears toward him, listening in that patient way horses have, and it was close enough to companionship for him now. Around mid-morning, Silas walked into town. It was Tuesday, his supply day. He moved slow, favoring his left leg where a green-broke colt had kicked him 30 years back. The injury had healed, but it left him with a hitch in his step that got worse as the day wore on. He carried an old canvas sack over his shoulder and wore the same clothes he'd worn for the past decade, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, a vest that Margaret had made for him before she died, and a hat so old and weather-beaten it had no identifiable color left. The general store belonged to a man named Porter Finch, a transplant from Ohio who'd come west for his health and stayed for the opportunity. Finch was cordial to Silas, but distant, the way you might be polite to a piece of furniture that had always been there but served no particular purpose. Silas bought flour, coffee, beans, a little bacon. He paid in coins, counted out carefully from a leather pouch, and accepted his change without comment. As he was leaving, Sarah Henley came in. She was Doc Henley's daughter, a woman in her early 40s who'd come back to Redemption Flats 5 years ago after her husband died in a railroad accident back east. She'd taken over helping her aging father with his practice and had earned the respect of the town through her competence and her kindness. She was one of the few people who still spoke to Silas like he was a real person, not a ghost. "Morning, Silas," she said, her smile genuine. "How's Patience doing?" "Still eating me out of house and home," Silas replied, and the corner of his mouth turned up slightly. "But she's good, keeping me company." "I'm glad," Sarah said. "You know, Mrs. Patterson was asking about you the other day. She wanted to know if you'd look at her mare. The animal's been acting strange, nervous-like." Silas shook his head slowly. "I don't do that work anymore, Sarah. You know that." "I know," she said gently. "But the knowing doesn't leave you, does it? What you had with horses, that was a gift." He looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "Gifts are meant to be used," he said finally. "When you stop using them, maybe they aren't gifts anymore. Maybe they're just memories." Sarah touched his arm briefly. "I don't believe that. I think some things are part of who you are, whether you use them or not. Silas nodded, not quite agreeing but not wanting to argue. He tipped his hat to her and walked out into the bright morning sunshine. He was halfway down the main street, heading back toward his cabin, when he heard the first sounds of trouble. Shouting from the north end of town, near Blackwood's corrals. Then a crash, the sound of splintering wood, and more shouting, this time with an edge of panic in it. Silas stopped walking. Other people on the street had stopped too, turning to look toward the commotion. A man came running down the street, one of Blackwood's hired hands, his face red with exertion. "The Black Stallion," he was yelling. "Diablo broke out. He's coming this way." People started moving then, fast. Women grabbed children and pulled them toward doorways. Men reached for guns. Shopkeepers started closing shutters. In the space of 30 seconds, the orderly main street of Redemption Flats transformed into something close to chaos. Silas stood still, his supply sack still over his shoulder, and looked north. He could hear it now, the thunder of hooves on hard-packed dirt, getting closer. The sound a running horse makes is distinctive, unmistakable. But this was different. This wasn't the sound of a horse running toward something. This was the sound of a horse running away from something, running blind with fear or pain or rage. A few men had taken up positions with rifles, setting up behind water troughs and at the corners of buildings. Blackwood himself came running down the street, his face twisted with fury, a rifle in his hands. "Somebody shoot that devil," he was shouting. "That horse is worth dead or alive, and I'll be damned if I let him tear up this town." Silas felt something shift inside him then, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was like waking up from a deep sleep, or like remembering a language you thought you'd forgotten. He set down his supply sack carefully against the wall of the general store and stepped out into the middle of the street. Then he saw the horse. Diablo came around the corner from the north road at full gallop, and even in that first glimpse, Silas could see that this was no ordinary animal. The stallion was magnificent coal-black, with that distinctive white star, powerfully muscled, moving with a terrible beauty, even in his panic. But there was something wrong. The horse's head was tossing wildly, foam flecking his muzzle, and his eyes showed white all around. This wasn't an angry horse. This wasn't a mean horse trying to cause trouble. This was a terrified animal in terrible pain. The stallion thundered down the main street, and people scattered before him like leaves before a wind. A water trough went over with a crash. A hitching post splintered. The horse reared up, screaming that high, piercing sound that horses make when they're beyond reason, and his front hooves came down hard enough to crack the wooden boards of the sidewalk. Blackwood raised his rifle. Other men did the same. In another moment, a dozen bullets would cut the stallion down, and that would be the end of the legend of Diablo. Silas stepped forward into the middle of the street and raised his hand. "Hold your fire," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but something in it cut through the noise and panic. "That horse isn't trying to hurt anybody. He's trying to tell you something." Blackwood swung his rifle toward Silas. "Get out of the way, old man. That animal's dangerous." "The only dangerous thing here," Silas said, still calm, still with his hand raised, "is shooting a scared horse in the middle of town. You want to take that shot, Blackwood, you go ahead, but you'll have to shoot through me first." The stallion had stopped at the far end of the street, maybe 100 feet away. He was still tossing his head, still showing the whites of his eyes, but he'd stopped running. He was watching Silas now, and in that moment, something passed between the old man and the horse. Some recognition, some acknowledgement that neither of them could have put into words. Silas started walking forward, slow and steady, his hand still raised in that universal gesture of peace. The world narrowed down to just two beings, an old man and a wild horse, facing each other across a street filled with frightened people and loaded guns. Silas kept walking, one slow step at a time, his eyes never leaving the stallion's face. He could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke. Behind him, someone was arguing with Blackwood, trying to convince him to lower the rifle, Sarah Henley's voice insistent. But Silas shut it all out. Right now, there was only him and the horse. Diablo stamped one front hoof, a warning. His nostrils flared wide, pulling in Silas's scent. The horse's whole body was trembling, muscles twitching under that gleaming black coat. Silas could see the foam on his muzzle now, see the way the stallion held his head at an odd angle, tilted slightly to the left, as if trying to ease some pain. "Easy now," Silas said, his voice low and gentle. The tone he used to use in the round pen all those years ago. "Easy, boy. Nobody here wants to hurt you. I know you've had hurt enough for one lifetime." The stallion's ears swiveled forward, focusing on Silas's voice. It was a good sign, a small crack in the wall of fear. Silas kept walking, kept talking, his words a steady stream of calm in all the chaos. "I see you, big fella. I see what they don't see. You're not mean. You're not a devil. You're just hurting, and you don't know how to tell anybody about it. Well, I'm listening now. I'm right here. And I'm listening." He was 30 feet away now, close enough to see the scars on the horse's hide, the marks of ropes and whips and bullets. Close enough to see the intelligence in those dark eyes, the awareness that made this animal more than just meat and muscle. Close enough to die if he'd read this wrong. Behind him, Blackwood was shouting again, "Croft, you fool! Get away from that horse!" Silas didn't turn around. He took another step, then another. 20 feet now. The stallion reared up again, less violent this time, more of a warning than an attack. When his hooves came down, Silas was still walking forward. "That's right," he said. "You show me what hurts. You tell me in the only way you know how. I'm not afraid of you, boy. I've been where you are. I know what it's like when the pain gets so big it's all you can feel, when you do anything just to make it stop. But hurting other folks doesn't make your hurt go away. You know that, don't you?" 15 feet, 10, the stallion was breathing hard, his sides heaving. Up close, Silas could see just how magnificent this animal really was. Nearly 17 hands high, with a chest like a barrel and legs built for speed and endurance. This was the kind of horse men wrote songs about, the kind that deserved better than fear and violence. Silas stopped walking when he was just 6 feet from the horse's head. He kept his hand raised, kept his voice steady. "I'm going to come closer now. I'm going to find what's hurting you. You can let me, or you can fight me. But I think you're tired of fighting. I think you want somebody to help, even if you don't know how to ask for it." The stallion's nostrils flared again. His ears went back, then forward, then back again. Uncertainty, the first real doubt in all that fear and rage. Silas took one more step, close enough now that he could reach out and touch the horse if he wanted to. He didn't touch, not yet. He just stood there, breathing slow and steady, letting the stallion study him, letting the animal understand that this human was different from the ones who'd chased him, roped him, beaten him. This human wasn't holding a whip or a gun. This human's hands were empty and open. The street had gone completely silent. Even Blackwood had stopped shouting. Everyone was watching, holding their breath, waiting to see if the old man would die or if something else would happen, something none of them could quite imagine. Silas slowly lowered his raised hand and extended it toward the horse, palm down, fingers relaxed. It was the way you greeted a strange dog, letting them smell you, letting them decide if you were safe. The stallion stretched his neck forward, his muzzle coming closer to Silas's hand. The horse's breath was hot and smelled of fear and exhaustion. Then, contact. The stallion's nose touched Silas's hand, just barely, the softest brush of contact. Silas didn't move, didn't grab, didn't do anything, but stand there and let the horse make the choice. After a moment, the stallion blew out through his nostrils, a long exhale that seemed to carry some of the tension out with it. "There you are," Silas said softly. "There's the real you, under all that fear. I knew you were in there." He moved his hand slightly, gently, up along the horse's face. The stallion flinched but didn't pull away. Silas kept his touch light, careful, moving up toward the animal's ears. He was looking for the source of the pain, the thing that had driven this magnificent creature to break out of Blackwood's corral and run blind through town. And then he found it. Just behind the stallion's left ear, hidden under the thick mane, Silas's fingers touched something wrong. The horse threw his head up, a sound close to a sob coming from deep in his chest. Silas pulled his hand back, looked at his fingers. Blood, fresh blood, and something else, the smell of infection, of wound gone bad. "Easy now," Silas said, reaching up again, more carefully this time. "I know it hurts. Let me see. Let me help." He worked his fingers carefully into the thick hair of the mane, moving slow, talking the whole time. The stallion trembled under his touch but stood still, as if he understood somehow that this pain was different from the pain that had been inflicted on him before. This pain was the pain of healing, of help. Silas found the wound and his jaw tightened. It was a deep gash, maybe 4 inches long, that ran from behind the horse's ear down along his neck. The edges of it were swollen and angry, infected, and embedded in the wound, rusted and cruel, were 3 strands of barbed wire, twisted together and driven deep into the flesh. "Lord, have mercy," Silas breathed. He turned and called out to the watching crowd, his voice carrying clear down the street. "Sarah, I need you here. Bring your father's medical bag. And somebody bring me a bucket of clean water, soap, and some clean cloth." Sarah was moving before he finished speaking, running toward her father's office. Other people started moving too, the spell of frozen silence broken, but they kept their distance, still afraid of the horse, still waiting to see what would happen. Blackwood pushed through the crowd, his rifle still in his hands. His face was red with anger and something else, embarrassment maybe, at having missed something so obvious. "What is it? What's wrong with him?" Silas turned and looked at Blackwood, and in that look was everything he thought about men like him, about cruelty disguised as toughness, about ignorance that called itself strength. "Barbed wire," he said, embedded deep in a wound behind his ear, infected. Probably been there for days, maybe longer. This horse wasn't trying to hurt anybody. He was just trying to get away from the pain. Blackwood's face went from red to pale. We didn't know." "You didn't look," Silas said, and his voice was hard as stone. "You were so busy trying to break his spirit, you never thought to check if something was breaking his body. You're not a horseman, Blackwood. You're just a man with a whip." Sarah arrived with her father's medical bag, and Doc Henley himself came limping behind her, his old legs not quite keeping up. The doctor took one look at the situation and set his bag down at a safe distance. "Tell me what you need." "Silas, tweezers if you've got them. Strong ones. Carbolic solution for cleaning. Needle and thread for stitching. And I'll need someone to hold a lamp close once I start working. This is going to take some time." The stallion's head drooped slightly, as if the admission that help was coming had allowed him to acknowledge just how tired and hurt he really was. Silas kept one hand on the horse's neck, a steady contact, a promise that he wouldn't abandon him now. People brought water, brought cloth, brought a lamp. Someone set up a small table nearby, with the medical supplies laid out carefully. The whole town, it seemed, had gathered at a respectful distance, watching this strange scene, an old man they'd dismissed as irrelevant, standing in the middle of their street with a legendary wild horse who'd become as calm as a prayer. Silas looked at the stallion's dark eye, saw his own reflection there, and something in him that had been sleeping for 15 years finally woke up all the way. "All right, boy," he said quietly. "This is going to hurt, and I'm sorry for that. But it's the hurt that leads to healing, not the hurt that breaks you down. You trust me now, and I'll see you through to the other side." The stallion's ear swiveled toward him, listening, and in the fading afternoon light of Redemption Flats, with half the town watching and holding their breath, Silas Croft went to work. The work took 2 hours. 2 hours of careful, painstaking extraction, with Silas's steady hands working the barbed wire free strand by strand, while the stallion stood trembling but still. Sarah held the lamp close, her face tight with concentration. Doc Henley handed over instruments and offered quiet advice. The crowd had thinned some, but maybe 50 people still stood watching, and more kept arriving as word spread through town of what was happening on Main Street. Silas talked to the horse the entire time, his voice a constant thread of reassurance. "That's the way. You're doing fine. I know it burns. I know it does. Just a little more now. You're the bravest thing I've seen in years, you know that? Most horses would have kicked me into next week by now, but not you. You know I'm trying to help." When the last piece of wire came free, slick with blood and pus, Silas dropped it on the ground with a sound of disgust. The wound was ugly, deep and ragged, but now that it was clean he could see it wasn't as bad as it could have been. The infection hadn't spread to the bone. With proper care, it would heal. He cleaned the wound thoroughly with carbolic solution, the horse flinching but holding steady. Then he stitched it closed with small, neat sutures, the kind of work a man does when he cares about the outcome. Sarah watched his hands with professional interest. "You're good at this," she said quietly. "You ever think about doing it for a living?" Silas almost smiled. "I did once, long time ago. When the stitching was done, he wrapped the wound with clean bandages, tying them secure but not too tight. The stallion's head had drooped lower, exhausted by pain and fear and the long ordeal of healing. Silas ran his hand along the horse's neck one more time, feeling the powerful muscles, the life still strong in this animal despite everything that had been done to him. "There now," he said. "The worst is over. You'll be sore for a while, and we'll need to keep that wound clean, but you're going to be all right." He turned to face Blackwood, who'd been standing off to the side the whole time, his face unreadable. "This horse needs rest and gentle care. He needs a clean stall, fresh water, good hay, and he needs to be left alone. No ropes, no whips, no breaking." Blackwood's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "That horse is my property, Croft. I paid good money for him." "Property," Silas repeated, and there was something cold in his voice. "You hear that? All of you? This living, feeling creature that just stood still for 2 hours while we worked on him. Blackwood here calls him property, like he's a wagon or a plough." A murmur ran through the crowd. People were looking at Blackwood differently now, and not in a way he'd like. The horsebreaker shifted his weight. Uncomfortable. "I didn't know about the wire," Blackwood said defensively. "How was I supposed to know?" "You look," Sarah Henley said, her voice sharp. "You look at the animals in your care, and you pay attention to them. That's what being responsible means." Blackwood's face reddened. "Fine, fine. The horse can rest. But come tomorrow, I've got a contract to fulfill. That stallion goes to the fort in 2 weeks, broken or not." "He won't be ready in 2 weeks," Silas said. "That wound needs time to heal proper. You push him too soon, the infection will come back worse, and then you'll have nothing but a dead horse and a broken contract. So what am I supposed to do? I've got money tied up in that animal." Silas looked at the stallion, at the way the horse's eyes had half closed, the trust that had been built in the past 2 hours. Something was settling in his chest, a decision he hadn't known he was going to make until the words came out of his mouth. "I'll take him," he said. "For now, I'll keep him at my place, tend the wound, get him healthy. When he's healed, we can talk about what comes next." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "And why would I agree to that?" "Because," Doc Henley spoke up, his old voice carrying authority, "if that horse dies or gets worse under your care, the whole town will know you let it happen after being warned. But if Silas here manages to save him, maybe you get to sell a healthy horse instead of a sick one. Seems like simple math to me." Other voices from the crowd echoed agreement. Blackwood looked around, seeing how the wind was blowing, and he didn't like it. But he was businessman enough to know when he'd lost the room. "1 month," he said finally. "You get 1 month to heal him up. Then he comes back to me, and we finish what we started." Silas nodded slowly. 1 month. Getting the stallion to his cabin was an exercise in patience. The horse was exhausted and in pain, and Silas didn't have a rope or halter that would work on an animal this size. In the end, He just started walking, and the stallion followed him. It was that simple and that profound. The legendary Diablo, the horse that no man could tame, walked through the streets of Redemption Flats behind an old man with a limp, following him like a dog follows its master. People came out of their houses to watch them pass. Children pointed and whispered. Women stood on porches with their hands over their mouths. Men shook their heads in wonder. By the time Silas and the stallion reached his cabin at the edge of town, the story had already begun to change in the telling, growing larger and more mythical with each retelling. At the cabin, Silas led the horse to the small lean-to beside his barn, where patients usually sheltered from the rain. The old mare was there now, and she looked up with interest as the stallion approached. To Silas's surprise, Diablo nickered softly at her, the first sound he'd made that wasn't born of fear or pain. Patience walked over and touched noses with him, a gentle greeting between horses. "You've got a friend," Silas told the stallion. "That's Patience. She's old and wise, and she'll show you the ropes around here." He brought fresh hay and water, set them where the horse could reach them easily without straining his wounded neck. Then he pulled up an old wooden chair and simply sat there, watching the stallion begin to eat, slowly at first, then with more confidence. The sun was setting now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Silas sat in that fading light and thought about the day, about how a morning that had started ordinary had turned into something else entirely. He thought about the weight of the horse's muzzle against his hand, the trust in those dark eyes, the way his own hands had remembered skills he'd thought were lost to time. Margaret used to say that some things chose you, not the other way around. You didn't decide to be good with horses, or good at healing, or good at loving. Those things found you and claimed you, and all you could do was say yes or say no. Silas had been saying no for 15 years. Today, without quite meaning to, he'd said yes. Inside the cabin, he made himself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, then took his coffee back outside. The stallion was lying down now, resting, his breathing slow and even. Patience stood nearby, a quiet guardian. Silas settled into his chair on the porch and watched the stars come out one by one. He was under no illusions about what he'd taken on. Healing the horse's body was only the beginning. Diablo had been hurt by men, chased and caught and beaten and caged. That kind of hurt went deeper than any wound. The real work would be teaching this animal that not all humans were enemies, that trust was possible, that the world could be gentle sometimes instead of cruel. It was work that would take time and patience and a kind of faith that things could be better than they'd been. Silas understood that kind of work. He'd been doing it on himself for 15 years, with mixed results. Maybe, he thought, maybe healing the horse would help him finish healing himself. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Blackwood wouldn't give up easily on his investment. The town would have opinions about the old man and the wild horse. The wound would need tending, careful and daily. There would be setbacks and struggles, moments of doubt and difficulty. But tonight, in the cool mountain air with the stars overhead and 2 horses resting peacefully in his small shelter, Silas Croft felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He felt useful. He felt needed. He felt, for the first time since Margaret died, like maybe there was still purpose left in the years he had remaining. He finished his coffee and stood up, his back protesting the hours he'd spent bent over the stallion's wound. He was old, and his body reminded him of it daily. But old didn't mean useless. Old didn't mean finished. Sometimes old meant you'd lived long enough to know what really mattered, and you'd learned enough to do something about it. "Sleep well, boy," he called softly to the stallion. "Tomorrow we start the real work." In the darkness, the horse's ear swiveled toward his voice, listening. The first week was harder than Silas had anticipated. Not because of the horse. Diablo proved to be a surprisingly patient invalid, standing still while Silas changed his bandages and cleaned the wound twice daily. The hard part was everything else. The visitors, The questions, the endless stream of townspeople who suddenly found reasons to walk past his cabin, hoping for a glimpse of the famous Stallion. Some came with genuine interest. Others came with advice, most of it useless. A few came with warnings, convinced that Silas was putting himself in danger by keeping such a wild animal so close. And some, Silas suspected, came just to watch and wait for him to fail, to prove that the old man was as useless as they'd always believed. He tolerated them all with quiet patience, answering questions when he had to, ignoring them when he could. But it wore on him, this sudden attention. He'd grown used to being invisible, to moving through the world without anyone really seeing him. Now, he was seen too much, and he didn't care for it. The one visitor he welcomed was Sarah Henley. She came by on the third day, bringing fresh bandages and a jar of salve her father had prepared for the wound. "How's he doing?" she asked, approaching the lean-to slowly. The stallion raised his head, watching her with wary eyes, but he didn't move away. "Healing well," Silas said. "No sign of the infection spreading. He's eating good, drinking plenty of water. His spirit's coming back too, I can see it in his eyes." Sarah watched as Silas approached the horse, how the stallion lowered his head to accept Silas's touch. "It's remarkable," she said, "the way he trusts you. 3 days ago he was running wild through town, and now look at him." "He doesn't trust people," Silas corrected gently. "He trusts me. There's a difference. Trust has to be earned with horses, same as with people. You can't demand it or force it. You can only offer it and hope it gets offered back." "Is that what you did? Offered trust?" Silas thought about that while his hands worked carefully at the bandages, unwinding the old cloth and examining the wound beneath. It was healing clean, the edges drawing together nicely. "I offered him the truth," he said finally. "I didn't pretend to be something I wasn't. Didn't promise him things I couldn't deliver, just showed him that I saw his pain and wanted to help. Sometimes that's all anybody needs, to be seen and understood." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching him work. "You sound like you're talking about more than horses." Silas smiled slightly, a rare expression on his weathered face. "Maybe I am." She helped him apply the salve and wrap fresh bandages, and they worked in comfortable silence. When they were finished, she stood back and studied the stallion with professional assessment. "He's in remarkably good condition, considering. Strong muscle tone, good weight. Whatever else Blackwood did wrong, he at least fed him properly." "Blackwood's not a monster," Silas said, surprising himself with the defense. "He's just a man who learned the wrong lessons. Somebody taught him that breaking a horse meant breaking its spirit, and he never questioned whether that was right. Sometimes ignorance does more harm than malice. Will you be able to teach him differently? Blackwood, I mean. I don't know. Teaching requires somebody willing to learn, and I'm not sure Blackwood wants to learn. He just wants results." Silas patted the stallion's shoulder, then stepped back. "But maybe when he sees what can be accomplished without cruelty, he'll start asking questions. That's all I can hope for." By the end of the first week, a routine had established itself. Silas woke before dawn, made his coffee, and went out to check on the horses. He'd cleaned Diablo's wound first thing, while the morning was still cool and the flies hadn't yet become active. Then he'd turn Patience out into the meadow and spend time just being near the stallion, sitting on his porch or standing by the lean-to, reading aloud from the newspapers that arrived weekly from Denver, talking about nothing in particular. He was teaching the horse that human presence didn't always mean pain or work or demands. Sometimes it just meant company, companionship without expectation. In the afternoons, he'd work in his small garden, weeding and watering, always aware of the stallion watching him. Horses are curious creatures by nature, and Diablo would stand at the edge of the lean-to, his head over the rail, tracking Silas's movements with interest. Gradually, the horse's body language changed. His ears stayed forward more often. His head remained low and relaxed. The constant tension began to ease from his muscles. On the 8th day, something remarkable happened. Silas was sitting on his porch, mending a tear in his spare shirt, when he felt something warm and solid against his shoulder. He looked up slowly. The stallion had walked over from the lean-to, had crossed the yard on his own, and now stood beside the porch, with his muzzle resting gently against Silas's shoulder. Silas didn't move, barely dared to breathe. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The moment when the horse chose connection rather than having it forced upon him. He lifted his hand slowly and placed it against the stallion's neck, feeling the life thrumming beneath the hide. "Hello, friend," he said softly. "Glad you decided to come visit." The horse blew out through his nostrils, warm breath ruffling Silas's hair. They stayed like that for several minutes, man and horse, connected in a way that went beyond words or understanding. When Diablo finally pulled away and wandered back to the lean-to, Silas felt something shift in his chest, a tightness he'd been carrying for years that loosened just slightly. Not everyone in town was pleased with Silas's progress. Cyrus Blackwood came by on the 10th day, his face set in hard lines. He stood at the edge of Silas's property, looking at the stallion with an expression that might have been regret or might have been calculation. "Horse looks good," he said, not quite managing to make it sound like a compliment. "He's healing," Silas agreed. "Still got 3 weeks left on our deal, then he comes back to me." That was the agreement. Blackwood shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Town's talking, saying I was cruel to him, that I didn't know what I was doing. Bad for business. That kind of talk. Maybe you should think about changing how you do business then. And maybe you should remember that I'm the one who's been supplying horses to the army for the past 6 months. Good, reliable horses that do their job. Results matter, Croft, not feelings. Silas looked at him for a long moment. You ever stop to think that maybe you'd get better results if you cared about feelings? A horse that trusts you will do things. A horse that fears you never will. Fear gets you obedience. Trust gets you partnership. Pretty words, Blackwood said. But I work in the real world, not in some fantasy where horses and men are friends. Animals are animals. They need to be controlled. Is that what you think I'm doing here? Controlling him? I don't know what you're doing here, but in 3 weeks I'll take him back and finish the job I started, make him useful. He's already useful, Silas said quietly. He's teaching this town something about mercy, teaching me something too. That's worth more than any contract. Blackwood shook his head and walked away, but not before Silas saw something flicker across his face. Doubt, maybe, or curiosity. It was a start. A small one, but still. That night, Silas lay awake in his bed, listening to the sounds of the night owls calling, the wind in the pines, the occasional stamp of hooves from the lean-to where the horses rested. He thought about Blackwood's words, about control and usefulness, and the real world. He thought about Margaret and the way she'd taught him, through years of patience and love, that the real world was bigger and stranger and more full of possibility than most people ever imagined. The real world included moments like this afternoon, when a wild horse chose to rest his head on an old man's shoulder. It included the way Patience had welcomed Diablo without fear, the way the town had watched in wonder as trust replaced violence. It included second chances and unexpected grace, and the possibility that people could change if they were given reason and time. Silas had 3 weeks left to prove what he knew in his bones to be true, that kindness was stronger than cruelty, that patience was more powerful than force, that an old man and a wild horse could teach a town something worth learning. 3 weeks to heal more than just a wound, to mend more than just one animal's broken trust. It wasn't much time. But then again, miracles didn't run on schedules. They ran on faith and hope, and the stubborn refusal to accept that things had to be the way they'd always been. In the darkness, Silas smiled. He'd spent 15 years believing his useful days were behind him. Now here he was, embarked on perhaps the most important work of his life. Margaret would have laughed at the timing of it, would have said something wise about how the universe provides what we need when we need it, even if we're too stubborn to ask. I hear you, love, he whispered to the empty room. I'm paying attention now, I promise. Outside, under the stars, a stallion named Diablo dreamed of open spaces and running free, his wounds healing, his heart learning that not all hands brought pain. The second week brought changes both welcome and worrying. Diablo's wound had healed enough that Silas could remove the stitches, revealing a clean scar that would fade with time. The horse moved with more freedom now, no longer favoring his neck, and his coat had taken on a healthier shine from good food and proper care. He'd even begun to play a little, trotting around the small paddock Silas had set up, tossing his head and kicking up his heels in ways that spoke of returning joy. But with health came restlessness. Diablo was a creature built for wide spaces and long runs, and Silas's small property couldn't contain the horse's spirit indefinitely. The stallion would stand at the fence line, looking out toward the mountains, and Silas could read the longing in his stance. This was an animal meant to be free, and every day of captivity, no matter how gentle, was a kind of slow dying. The question Silas wrestled with was this: what came after healing? What was the right thing to do with a horse like Diablo, a horse that belonged to no one and everyone, that was both legend and living creature? Return him to Blackwood meant returning him to methods that would break his spirit. Set him free meant losing all the trust they'd built and leaving him vulnerable to the next man who wanted to claim him. Keep him meant keeping him caged, and Silas had seen enough of cages to know they damaged more than bodies. He talked about it with Sarah when she came by on the 14th day. They were sitting on his porch in the late afternoon, watching Diablo graze alongside Patience in the meadow. The two horses had become inseparable, the old mare and the young stallion, an unlikely pair that nonetheless fit together perfectly. "What will you do when the month is up?" Sarah asked. "Blackwood won't let you keep him. That horse represents too much money." "I know," Silas said, "and I gave my word. That matters to me. Even when keeping your word means sending Diablo back to be broken, I didn't promise to send him back to be broken. I promised to heal him. After that, we'd talk about what comes next. That's what I intend to do, talk. Try to make Blackwood see there's another way." Sarah looked doubtful. "Men like Blackwood don't change their minds easily. They see compromise as weakness." "Then I'll have to find a way to make change look like strength," Silas replied. He was quiet for a moment, watching the horses. "There's something I haven't told you. Something I've been thinking about since that first day." "What's that?" "I want to buy him. From Blackwood. I'll pay what he would have gotten from the army contract, maybe more if I can scrape it together. Keep Diablo here. Let him heal all the way, not just his body, but his trust in the world. Then when he's ready, if he wants to stay, he can, and if he wants to go, I'll let him." "That's a considerable amount of money," Sarah said gently. "Do you have it?" Silas shook his head. "Not yet, but I've got some things I can sell. Margaret's good china that we never used, been sitting in boxes since she died. Some tools I don't need anymore. My Da's pocket watch, which is worth something to a collector. It won't be enough, probably, but it's a start." Sarah was quiet, thinking. Then she said, "What if the town helped, took up a collection?" "I won't ask people for charity. It's not charity if they want to help. Silas, you did something remarkable that day on Main Street. People saw it. Some of them have been talking about it ever since, about the old man who stood up to guns and fear and chose kindness instead. You reminded folks of something they'd forgotten about themselves. Let them be part of finishing what you started." Silas felt uncomfortable with the idea, but he could see the sense in it. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford if it meant losing Diablo to Blackwood's methods. "I'll think about it," he said, which they both knew meant yes. That night, something happened that changed everything. Silas woke to the sound of shouting from the direction of Blackwood's corrals. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, straining to hear. More shouting, then a gunshot, then silence. His heart hammering, he grabbed his lantern and started walking toward town, his bad leg protesting every step. He met Blackwood's hired hand, a young man named Tommy, running the other way. The boy's face was pale in the lantern light. "What happened?" Silas demanded. "Fire!" Tommy gasped. "Someone set fire to Mr. Blackwood's barn. We got it out mostly, but some of the horses got loose in the confusion. Mr. Blackwood thinks it might have been someone trying to steal them." "Anyone hurt?" "No, sir. Just scared. But Mr. Blackwood's mad as hell, begging your pardon. He's blaming you for it, saying you've turned the town against him." Silas felt cold. "I haven't turned anybody against anything. All I did was heal a horse." "Yes, sir, but folks are talking, saying Mr. Blackwood's methods are cruel, that there's better ways. Some of the ranchers who were bringing him horses are taking their business elsewhere now. He's lost 3 contracts this week. And now this fire on top of everything else, he thinks somebody's trying to put him out of business." Silas walked on toward the corrals, despite Tommy's protests. He found Blackwood standing in front of his half-burned barn, his face black with soot and rage. When he saw Silas, his hand went to the gun on his hip. "You," he snarled. "This is your fault." "I had nothing to do with any fire," Silas said calmly. "Maybe not directly, but you started this. You made me look like a fool in front of the whole town, turned people against me with your soft words and your gentle ways. Now someone's trying to burn me out. If people are turning away from your methods, maybe that's because they've seen there's a better path. That's not on me, Blackwood. That's on you for choosing cruelty when kindness would have served just as well." Blackwood stepped forward, his face twisted. "That horse was supposed to make me money. Instead, he's cost me everything. Well, I'm done playing games. Our deal is off. I want Diablo back tomorrow. Tomorrow, Croft. And if you don't hand him over, I'll come and take him. The month isn't up yet. We had an agreement. Agreements are for men who trust each other. I don't trust you anymore. Tomorrow morning, or I'm coming with the sheriff and a warrant. Your choice." Silas felt his age in that moment, felt the weight of all his years pressing down on shoulders that were tired of carrying burdens. But he straightened up as much as his bad back would allow and looked Blackwood in the eye. "You come for that horse, you'll get him, but not broken, never broken. You want to finish the job you started, you'll have to go through me first. Don't be a fool, old man. You can't stop me. Maybe not, but I can make sure the whole town watches while you try, and they'll see exactly what kind of man you are when you drag a healing horse away from the one person who's shown him kindness. That's the reputation you'll carry, Blackwood. That's what people will remember." Blackwood's hand tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw. After a long moment, he turned away. "Tomorrow morning," he repeated. "Sunrise. Don't make me come looking." Silas walked back to his cabin in the darkness, his mind racing. He'd bought himself one more night. Maybe. One more night to figure out how to protect a horse who'd learned to trust him. One more night to find a solution that wouldn't end in violence or heartbreak. When he reached his property, he found Diablo standing at the fence, as if the horse had sensed his distress. Silas walked over and rested his forehead against the stallion's neck, breathing in the warm horse smell, feeling the solid reality of this creature he'd come to care about more than he'd thought possible. "I don't know what to do," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to keep you safe without breaking my word or breaking the law. All I know is that I can't let you go back to being hurt. I can't do that to you." The horse stood still, patient as his name, accepting Silas's weight and worry without complaint, and in that moment of connection, standing under stars that had watched over men and horses for thousands of years, Silas understood something important. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting you couldn't do it alone. Sometimes strength meant asking for help, even when pride said otherwise. He would go to the town, he would tell them what was happening, and he would ask them not for charity, but for justice, for mercy, for the chance to show that another way was possible. It was a risk, People might turn away, might say an old man and a wild horse weren't worth their time or money, but they might not. They might remember the day Diablo ran through town and Silas stood his ground. They might remember what it felt like to see compassion triumph over fear. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing Blackwood and his demands, but tonight Silas had a story to tell and hearts to reach. Tonight he had one last chance to prove that kindness wasn't weakness, that mercy wasn't foolishness, that an entire town could be better than its worst impulses if someone just gave them the opportunity to try. He patted Diablo's shoulder one more time, then turned toward his cabin. He had letters to write, people to contact, a plan to shape from nothing but hope and stubborn faith. The night was short, and morning would bring its reckoning. But first, there was work to do. Silas didn't sleep that night. He sat at his small table with pen and paper, writing by lamplight, choosing his words carefully. He wasn't an educated man in the formal sense. His schooling had ended at 12 when he'd gone to work on his father's ranch. But Margaret had loved words, had read to him every evening from books and newspapers, and some of that love had rubbed off on him over the years. He knew how to say what he meant, and he knew how to say it plain. By dawn, he had 3 letters written. One to Doc Henley, asking him to call a town meeting that evening in the church. One to the owner of the general store, asking permission to post a notice about that meeting. And one to Cyrus Blackwood, asking for a postponement of their deadline until after the town had a chance to speak. He didn't expect Blackwood to honor that last request, but he'd made it anyway, because a man should always try the peaceful path before resorting to harder methods. He delivered the letters personally, walking into town while the sun was still low and the streets were mostly empty. Doc Henley read his letter and nodded slowly. "I'll make it happen," the old doctor said. "I can't promise what the town will decide, but I can promise them a chance to hear you out." The store owner agreed to post the notice, and by mid-morning word had spread through Redemption Flats that something important was happening. A town meeting, called by Silas Croft. About the horse, people said. About Blackwood. About what kind of community they wanted to be. Blackwood's response came just after noon, delivered by Tommy. The boy handed Silas a note with shaking hands. It read, "No postponement. Sunrise tomorrow, like I said. The town can talk all they want, but that horse is mine by law and by money paid. Don't think a bunch of speeches will change that." Silas folded the note and tucked it in his pocket. "Tell Mr. Blackwood I received his message, and tell him I'll see him at the meeting tonight, if he cares to attend. He won't come, sir. He's pretty set against you right now. I know, but the invitation stands anyway. A man should have the chance to defend himself when people are discussing his business." That evening, the church filled up in a way it hadn't for anything except weddings and funerals in recent memory. Every bench was packed, and people stood along the walls and in the doorway. Silas arrived early and sat in the front row, his hands folded in his lap, his face calm despite the nervousness churning in his gut. Doc Henley stood at the front and called the meeting to order. His voice was strong for a man his age, carrying to the back of the room. "We're here tonight because one of our own has asked us to consider something important. Silas Croft has been a part of this community for 40 years. Some of us remember what he used to do, how he worked with horses. Others only know him as a quiet man who keeps to himself. But 2 weeks ago, all of us saw him do something remarkable. He stood up to fear and showed us another way. Now he's asking for our help. I think we owe it to him to listen." The doctor gestured to Silas, who stood slowly and turned to face the crowd. He saw familiar faces: Sarah Henley sitting with her father, Porter Finch from the general store, Mrs. Patterson, who'd wanted him to look at her mare, the blacksmith and the minister and the saloon keeper. He saw younger faces too, people who'd only lived in Redemption Flats a few years, who barely knew him. And in the back, standing apart from everyone else, he saw Cyrus Blackwood. The man had come after all. "Thank you for being here," Silas began, his voice steady. I won't take much of your time. You all know about the stallion Diablo. You know how he came to be in my care, know about the wound and the healing. What you might not know is that come tomorrow morning, he's supposed to go back to Mr. Blackwood, back to methods that I believe are wrong, that treat a living creature like a thing to be broken instead of a partner to be respected. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I want to buy that horse from Mr. Blackwood, want to pay him fair price for what he spent acquiring him, maybe more. Want to keep Diablo at my place until he's fully healed, in body and spirit both. And then, if the horse wants to go free, I'll let him go. If he wants to stay, I'll keep him safe and give him a good life. But I can't afford to do this alone. I'm an old man living on savings that were never much to begin with, so I'm here tonight to ask if any of you would be willing to help. A murmur ran through the crowd, some approving, some skeptical. Silas held up his hand. Before you answer, I want you to understand something. This isn't about me. It's not even really about the horse, though I've come to care for him more than I expected. This is about what kind of town we are, what kind of people we want to be. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. We can be the kind of place where might makes right, where animals are just property to be used however we see fit, where an old man's compassion is seen as foolishness. Or we can be the kind of place where mercy matters, where we look out for the helpless, whether they're human or not, where we believe that healing is better than breaking. Porter Finch stood up from the third row. How much money are we talking about, Silas? Blackwood paid $500 for Diablo, or so I heard. I've got maybe $200 worth of things I can sell, so I need $300 more, plus whatever extra it might take to convince him. That's a lot of money, someone called from the back. It is, Silas agreed, and I'm not asking anyone to give more than they can afford. Even $1 helps. But more than money, I'm asking you to stand with me. Tomorrow morning, when Blackwood comes for the horse, I want him to see that he's not just facing one old man. I want him to see a whole community that's chosen a different path. Sarah Henley stood. I'll contribute $50, she said, and my father will match it. Doc Henley nodded his agreement, and Silas felt his throat tighten with gratitude. The blacksmith stood next. I'll give $20, and I'll stand with you tomorrow morning, if you need someone at your side. $10 here, called Mrs. Patterson. That horse deserves better than what Blackwood would give him. One by one, people stood and pledged what they could. $5, $10, $20. A few could only offer $1 or $2, and Silas thanked them just as warmly as he thanked the larger donors. By the time the pledging was done, they'd raised $430 more than enough, with Silas's contribution, to meet Blackwood's price and then some. Silas stood there with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the generosity of people he'd believed had forgotten him. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. All of you. You've given me more than money tonight. You've given me faith that people can still be good to each other, still choose kindness over cruelty. I won't forget this. Then Blackwood's voice cut through the emotion in the room, hard and cold, real touching, all of this. But you're forgetting something important. That horse isn't for sale. I never said I'd sell him, just said I'd let you heal him up. Money doesn't change the fact that he's mine, legal and binding. The crowd murmured, confused and angry. Silas turned to face Blackwood. You'd turn down $600 for a horse you paid $500 for? I would, because this isn't about money anymore. It's about principle. You've all stood here tonight and said my methods are wrong, that I'm cruel, that I don't know how to handle horses. Well, I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to take that stallion and break him proper and sell him for $1,000 to prove that my way works. That sentiment and kindness don't matter as much as results. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd hoped appealing to Blackwood's business sense would work, but the man was operating on pride now, and pride was harder to negotiate with than greed. Then we have nothing more to discuss, Silas said quietly. No, we don't. I'll be at your place at sunrise, just like I said, and if you try to stop me, I'll bring the sheriff and the law, and you'll lose the horse and your dignity both. Blackwood turned and walked out of the church, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The crowd erupted in angry voices, people calling out suggestions and threats. Doc Henley called for order, but it took several minutes to restore quiet. Finally, he turned to Silas. "What will you do?" Silas looked at the money that had been pledged, at the faces of people who'd believed in him enough to open their wallets and their hearts. He thought about Diablo, about the trust they'd built, about what it would mean to hand that horse over to someone who would break him. He thought about Margaret and what she would say if she were here, and he made his decision. "I'll give him the horse," Silas said, and the room erupted in protests. He raised his hand for silence. "But I'll do it in a way that makes him prove his methods work. I'll challenge him to a contest, public and fair. He takes Diablo and works with him his way for 1 week. Then I get the horse back for 1 week and work with him my way. At the end, we demonstrate what each horse can do, and the town decides whose method is better. Winner keeps the horse." It was a risk, a huge risk. A week in Blackwood's hands could undo everything Silas had accomplished, could traumatize Diablo beyond repair. But it was the only way to resolve this that didn't involve lawyers and sheriffs, and a fight Silas couldn't win. The room was silent, people considering. Then the blacksmith spoke up. "I like it. Put your methods where your mouth is, Blackwood. Show us you're right." Others echoed the sentiment. It was fair, they said. It was just. It gave both men a chance to prove themselves. But Blackwood wasn't in the room to answer, and whether he'd agree to such terms, Silas couldn't say. He'd find out at sunrise, when the man came for his horse and the final confrontation began. Silas barely slept that night. He lay in his bed, watching the shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the horses outside. Diablo and Patience, breathing in the darkness, unaware of the storm that was coming with the morning sun. He thought about his plan, turned it over in his mind, looking for flaws, trying to convince himself he hadn't just made a terrible mistake. The truth was simpler and harder than he wanted to admit. He didn't know if his way would work. He'd gentled horses before, yes, but never one as traumatized as Diablo, never one who'd been hurt so badly by human hands. And he'd never done it under pressure, with the whole town watching, with everything riding on the outcome. He was 73 years old, his body slow and aching, his confidence not what it used to be. What if he failed? What if Blackwood's harsh methods actually produced better results, at least in the short term? What if he'd just sentenced Diablo to 2 weeks of torture for nothing? These thoughts circled his mind like buzzards until finally, around 4 in the morning, he gave up on sleep entirely. He rose, dressed, made coffee, and went outside to sit on his porch. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, stars fading one by one as dawn approached. He heard the horses moving in the lean-to, Patience's soft nicker and Diablo's answering rumble. Silas walked over to them, running his hands along both their necks. Patience leaned into his touch, old and trusting. Diablo stood alert but calm, his dark eyes reflecting the pre-dawn light. "I'm sorry," Silas told the stallion quietly. "I'm sorry for what's coming. But I promise you this, no matter what happens, I won't give up on you. You learned to trust me these past 2 weeks. I'm asking you to keep trusting just a little longer, even when it gets hard. Can you do that for me?" The horse's ear swiveled toward his voice, listening. Silas wished he could explain it all, wished he could make the stallion understand why he had to go back to Blackwood, why there had to be this contest, why the easy path of staying here safe and healing wasn't possible. But horses didn't understand human politics or legal obligations or the complex dance of pride and principle that governed men's choices. They only understood actions, intentions, the immediate reality of who was kind and who was cruel. Hoofbeats on the road interrupted his thoughts. Silas turned to see riders approaching, 5 of them, led by Blackwood. The sky was light enough now to see their faces, hard men who worked for Blackwood, who shared his philosophy about horses and breaking. They pulled up at the edge of his property, and Blackwood dismounted with a rope in his hands. "Sunrise," Blackwood said, as if Silas might have forgotten. "I've come for my property." "I know why you're here," Silas replied, "but before you take him, I have a proposition for you." He explained the challenge he'd outlined at the meeting: 1 week each, public demonstrations, let the town decide. As he talked, more people began arriving. Word had spread, apparently, that this confrontation was happening at sunrise. The blacksmith came, and Sarah Henley, and Doc Henley, with his medical bag, just in case. Porter Finch, from the general store, Mrs. Patterson, the minister. Within 20 minutes, there were maybe 40 people gathered at the edges of Silas's property, watching and waiting. Blackwood listened to the proposal with his arms crossed, his face skeptical. When Silas finished, he shook his head. "Why would I agree to that? The horse is mine. I don't need to prove anything to these people." "Because," Silas said carefully, "if you refuse, everyone here will know you were afraid to test your methods. They'll always wonder if maybe I was right, if maybe there was a better way, and you just didn't want to risk being proven wrong. I'm not afraid of anything." "Then prove it. Take the challenge. Show us all that your way works better. And if you win when you win, if you're so certain, you'll have not just a broken horse, but the satisfaction of knowing you were right all along." Blackwood chewed on that, his jaw working. Silas could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing pride against practicality. Finally, the horsebreaker nodded. "Fine, 1 week each. But I set the terms of the demonstration. I decide what the horse needs to be able to do to prove he's properly trained." "Fair enough," Silas agreed. "As long as the terms are the same for both of us. What you require of him after your week, I'll require after mine." "Agreed. And if I win, you never speak another word about my methods. You tell everyone who listen that Cyrus Blackwood knows horses better than some washed-up old man who's been out of the business for 15 years. And if I win," Silas countered, "you change how you work. You stop using fear and pain. You learn to be gentle." Blackwood laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Fine, though you won't win, so it doesn't matter. Now, are we doing this or not? I'm burning daylight." Silas walked over to Diablo. The stallion had been watching the exchange with wary eyes, ears flicking back and forth as he tracked the strange men and the growing crowd. When Silas approached, the horse moved toward him, seeking reassurance. "I know," Silas murmured, running his hand along the stallion's neck one last time. "I know this is hard. But remember what I told you, trust me a little longer. Just a little longer, and this will be over." He stepped back, and Blackwood moved in with his rope. The moment the horsebreaker got close, Diablo's whole demeanor changed. His ears pinned back, his eyes showed white, and he backed away fast, a sound close to a scream building in his chest. "Easy now," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked Silas's gentleness. It was the voice of a man used to commanding, not comforting. He moved faster, threw the rope, caught the horse around the neck. Diablo reared up, fighting, and for a terrible moment Silas thought the stallion might strike out with his hooves. But Blackwood's men moved in, more ropes, more hands, and within minutes they had the horse caught and held, trembling but contained. Watching it made Silas feel sick. He'd handed over a horse that trusted him to men who would terrorize him, and for what? Pride? A point to prove? What kind of man did that make him? Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. She stepped up beside him and spoke quietly. "You did the only thing you could. Sometimes the path to saving something requires letting it hurt first. That doesn't make it right. No. But it makes it necessary." Blackwood and his men led Diablo away, the stallion fighting every step, his eyes rolling back to find Silas one more time before he disappeared around the bend in the road. The crowd began to disperse, some following to watch where Blackwood would take the horse, others drifting back to town. Within an hour, Silas was alone again except for Patience, who stood at the fence, looking in the direction Diablo had gone, a soft, worried sound in her throat. Silas spent that day in a kind of fugue state, going through the motions of his life without really inhabiting it. He tried to work in his garden, but kept forgetting what he was doing. He tried to read, but couldn't focus on the words. He made coffee and let it go cold, untouched. The silence where Diablo should have been was deafening. That night, unable to stand it anymore, he walked into town. He found Tommy, Blackwood's hired hand, at the saloon. The young man looked uncomfortable when Silas approached, but he didn't run away. "How is he?" Silas asked simply. Tommy glanced around to make sure Blackwood wasn't nearby, then spoke low. "Not good, sir. He's been fighting all day. Won't eat, won't drink. Mr. Blackwood tried to work him in the round pen, and the horse nearly kicked his head off. He's in the isolation corral now, the strong one with the high walls. Mr. Blackwood says he'll break eventually. They always do, he says." Silas felt his hands curl into fists. "If Blackwood hurts that horse—" "He won't," Tommy interrupted. "Not permanently, anyway. He wants to win fair, wants to show his method works. But, sir, I've been doing this work for 3 years now, and I've never seen a horse fight this hard. That Stallion, he'd rather die than submit. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen." Silas thanked him and walked back home through the dark streets, his heart heavy. He'd thought he was doing the right thing, thought he was creating a chance to change minds and save a horse. But what if all he'd done was set up conditions for Diablo to be broken beyond repair, or worse, to break himself in the fighting? When he reached his cabin, he found Sarah Henley sitting on his porch, a basket beside her. "Brought you some dinner," she said. "Figured you wouldn't be taking care of yourself tonight." He sat down beside her with a heavy sigh. "I made a mistake, Sarah. I should never have let Blackwood take him. Maybe this is how it had to happen. Sometimes you can't show people the truth until you let them try their own way first and watch it fail. And if it doesn't fail, if Blackwood actually breaks him, then you'll have 1 week to undo the damage and show there's a better path. You're not done yet, Silas. The fight isn't over." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "You know what I think? I think that horse is tougher than Blackwood realizes. I think he's been through worse than anything Blackwood can dish out. And I think he remembers the 2 weeks he spent here, remembers what kindness feels like. That's not something you can beat out of a creature, not completely. The memory of it stays." Silas wanted to believe her. He closed his eyes and sent a message out into the darkness, hoping somehow it might reach a black stallion suffering in a corral on the edge of town. "Hold on, just hold on a little longer. I'm coming back for you, I promise." The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human promises and horse anguish and old men's regrets. But somewhere in the night, in a corral with walls too high to see over, a stallion named Diablo stood alone and remembered the feeling of gentle hands and the sound of a voice that spoke kindness instead of commands. And he held on, because that's what wild things do when they've found something worth staying alive for. They endure. The first 3 days of Blackwood's week were agony for Silas. He stayed away from the corrals. Part of the agreement was that neither man would interfere with the other's training time, but he couldn't stop thinking about what was happening there. He heard rumors, whispered reports from people who'd walked past Blackwood's operation. The stallion wasn't eating. The stallion had bloodied Blackwood's best rope man with a well-placed kick. The stallion had been worked in the round pen for 6 hours straight, driven to exhaustion, and still wouldn't submit to being handled. On the 4th day, Sarah came to visit with more troubling news. "My father treated one of Blackwood's men this morning. Broken arm from where Diablo threw him against the corral fence. The man said Blackwood's getting desperate, pushing harder, using methods even his own crew thinks are excessive." Silas stood up from where he'd been sitting on his porch, his hands shaking. "This has to stop. The agreement was 1 week, Sarah said gently. "We're only 4 days in. If you intervene now, Blackwood wins by default. You lose the horse, and you lose any chance to change minds about how things should be done. So I'm supposed to just sit here while that horse suffers?" "Yes," she said, and her voice was sad but firm. "That's exactly what you have to do. For 3 more days. Then you get your chance. But that night, Silas couldn't bear it anymore. He waited until well after dark, then walked into town and made his way quietly to Blackwood's corrals. He kept to the shadows, moving carefully, until he could see into the isolation pen where they were keeping Diablo. What he saw broke his heart. The stallion stood in the center of the corral, his head low, his sides heaving. Even in the moonlight, Silas could see fresh marks on his hide, rope burns, welts from what might have been a whip. The horse's spirit hadn't broken, but his body was taking punishment. He looked thin, likely from not eating, and his eyes had that hollow look Silas had seen in animals pushed beyond their limits. "I'm sorry," Silas whispered from the darkness. "I'm so sorry, boy. Just a little longer. Hold on just a little longer." As if he'd heard, Diablo lifted his head and looked directly at where Silas stood hidden in shadow. The horse's ears pricked forward, and he took a step toward the fence, then another. A soft nicker carried across the quiet night. He remembered. Despite everything, he remembered. Silas had to turn away before his presence was noticed. He walked home with tears on his face, something that hadn't happened since Margaret died. He'd thought himself too old and too hardened to cry, but watching that proud stallion suffer for his choices undid something in him. The next morning, the 5th day, Blackwood announced he was ready for the public demonstration. Word spread through town quickly that evening. At sunset, everyone was invited to watch the stallion respond to his training. Blackwood was confident enough to showcase his results 2 days early, which made Silas's stomach clench with worry. What had the man done to that horse? The whole town turned out. They gathered around Blackwood's largest corral as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Silas stood at the front of the crowd, his hat in his hands, his face carefully neutral despite the turmoil in his chest. Blackwood appeared, leading Diablo on a short lead rope. The horse was bridled and saddled, equipment that Silas knew the stallion had never accepted before. At first glance, it seemed like a triumph. Here was the wild horse, tacked up and under control. But Silas's experienced eye saw what others might have missed. Diablo's whole body was rigid with tension. His eyes showed white all around. Foam flecked his muzzle, and a fine trembling ran through his muscles. This wasn't a trained horse. This was a terrorized one, held in check by fear alone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying to the crowd, "you see before you the proof of effective horse training. 5 days ago, this animal was unmanageable, dangerous, wild, refusing all commands. Today, he accepts tack, he leads properly, and he'll carry a rider. This is what real horsemanship looks like, not sentiment or gentle words, but results." He handed the lead rope to one of his men and prepared to mount. Diablo stood still, but Silas could see the horse's sides heaving, could see the way his weight shifted onto his hind legs. Gathering himself, this was going to go wrong. He knew it with a certainty born of 40 years around horses. Blackwood put his foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the horse stood frozen. Then, with a scream that raised the hair on every neck in the crowd, Diablo exploded into motion. He bucked with a violence that was shocking to watch, his back arching, his hind legs kicking skyward. Blackwood, for all his claims of expertise, lasted maybe 5 seconds before he was launched from the saddle, landing hard in the dirt. The horse didn't stop. He bucked and twisted, fighting the saddle and bridle with desperate fury, crashing into the corral fence with enough force to crack the heavy timbers. The crowd scattered back, people shouting, children crying. Blackwood's men rushed in with ropes, trying to get control, but Diablo was beyond reason now. He was fighting for his life against enemies that existed only in his terror-soaked mind. It was Silas who finally brought calm. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct, he climbed over the corral fence and walked into the maelstrom. People shouted warnings, but he ignored them. He moved through the chaos like a man walking through still water, his hands loose at his sides, his voice low and steady. "Easy now, Diablo. Easy, boy. It's me. You know me. You remember me?" The horse's wild eyes found him, and something in that gaze changed. The bucking slowed, then stopped. Diablo stood trembling, every muscle taut, foam and sweat coating his hide. But he stood still as Silas approached, stood still as the old man's hands found the saddle cinch and loosened it, letting the hated thing fall away. Stood still as Silas unbuckled the bridle and slipped it free, revealing angry welts on the stallion's face where the bit had been forced too harshly. "There now," Silas murmured. "There now. The worst is over. You did so well holding on. I'm here now. I've got you." He turned to face Blackwood, who'd climbed back to his feet and was dusting off his pants, his face dark with humiliation and rage. The entire town had just watched him get thrown by the horse he'd promised to break. "That's not a trained horse," Silas said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. "That's a terrorized animal forced into temporary submission through pain and fear. There's a difference, and everyone here just saw it." "He would have settled," Blackwood protested. "Another few days, and he would have accepted it. Another few days might have killed him, or he might have killed someone. Fear-based training doesn't build partnership. It builds time bombs waiting to explode." Silas kept one hand on Diablo's neck, feeling the horse's rapid heartbeat beginning to slow. "You've had your week, and you've shown us your results. Now it's my turn." "The agreement was for a week each," Blackwood said. "You don't get him until tomorrow." "The agreement was until the demonstration," Doc Henley spoke up from the crowd. "You called for that demonstration early. Seems to me that means the week is over when you say it is. And you just said it was over by showing us what you'd accomplished." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Blackwood looked around, seeing no support, no sympathy. His methods had been laid bare for everyone to see, and they'd been found wanting. "Fine," he spat. "Take him. Try your gentle ways. But when your week is up and that horse is still wild, still dangerous, remember that I offered you the better path, and you refused it out of pride and sentiment." "I'll remember," Silas said. "I'll remember everything that's happened here." He led Diablo out of the corral without rope or halter, the horse following him like a shadow. The crowd parted to let them through, people staring in wonder at the sight. Behind him, Silas heard Blackwood ordering his men to clean up, heard the anger in the horsebreaker's voice, but that was behind him now. What lay ahead was the real work, not just healing a body this time, but healing a spirit that had been broken down and built back up on foundations of fear. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than it ever had before. Diablo followed close, so close that Silas could feel the horse's breath on his shoulder. Patience called out when they came into view, and Diablo answered with a nicker that sounded like relief, like homecoming. That night, Silas didn't sleep at all. He stayed outside with the horses, sitting on the ground with his back against the lean-to, watching the stars wheel overhead. Diablo stood nearby, not quite touching but close enough that Silas could have reached out and made contact if he wanted to. The horse was choosing proximity, choosing connection, after 5 days of forced isolation and brutality. It was a start, a small one, but real. And in the morning, the real work would begin. 1 week to rebuild what Blackwood had torn down. 1 week to prove that trust was stronger than fear, that gentleness was more powerful than force. 1 week to show a horse and a town that another way was possible. Silas looked at Diablo standing in the starlight, at the scars old and new that marked his hide, at the wariness that still hadn't left his eyes. This magnificent, damaged creature had survived so much. He'd survived cruel captures and crueler training, survived wounds infected and spirits broken, survived 5 days that might have destroyed a lesser animal. He'd survived because something in him refused to give up, refused to let the world beat all the wildness out of him. "Tomorrow," Silas promised quietly, "tomorrow we start putting you back together. Not the way you were before, that's lost, but something new, something better. A horse who's been broken by the world but chose to trust it again anyway. That's worth more than any unbroken wildness, boy. That's strength that runs deeper than fear." The stallion's ear swiveled toward his voice, listening, and in that small gesture, in that attention and focus, Silas found the hope he needed to believe the week ahead was possible. They'd both been broken by life, both rebuilt themselves from wreckage. Maybe together they could show others how it was done. Maybe that was what this had been about all along, not saving one horse, but showing one town that healing was always possible if you had the courage to reach for it. The night deepened, the stars watched, and an old man and a damaged horse waited for the sunrise that would bring their final chance to prove that kindness could triumph over cruelty, that love was stronger than fear, that sometimes the greatest strength was found not in dominance, but in the gentle persistence of those who refused to stop believing in better possibilities. The first day of Silas's week, he did nothing. Nothing at all, except exist in the same space as the horse. He sat on his porch with his coffee, reading his newspapers, occasionally talking to Patience when she wandered by. He tended his garden, pulling weeds and watering plants. He cooked his simple meals and ate them outside where Diablo could see him. He moved through his normal rhythms, deliberately ordinary, showing the horse that life here could be calm and predictable and safe. Diablo watched him from the lean-to, wary but curious. The stallion ate the hay Silas provided and drank the fresh water, but he stayed at a distance, rebuilding the trust that had been shattered during Blackwood's brutal week. Silas didn't push. He'd learned long ago that the worst thing you could do with a traumatized horse was rush the healing. Time moved differently for animals. They lived in the present moment, and each moment of safety helped erase the memories of fear. On the second day, Silas began talking to the horse more deliberately. Not training talk, not commands or instructions, just conversation, the way you'd talk to a friend. He told Diablo about Margaret, about the life they'd built together in this valley. He talked about the mountains and the seasons, about the first time he'd ever gentled a wild horse, and how terrified he'd been that he'd do it wrong. He shared his doubts and fears about the demonstration that was coming, admitted that he wasn't sure he could undo the damage Blackwood had inflicted. The stallion's ears tracked his voice, swiveling to catch every word. By late afternoon on the second day, Diablo had moved closer, standing just outside the lean-to, choosing to be nearer to Silas's voice, even though it meant leaving the shelter. On the third day, Silas started working with him physically, but so gently that most people wouldn't have recognized it as training. He simply stood near the horse and ran his hands along Diablo's neck and shoulder, finding the places where tension lived in the muscles and working them loose with patient pressure. The stallion flinched at first, expecting pain, but when none came, he gradually relaxed into the touch. Silas found knots and sore spots, the lingering effects of ropes too tight and work too hard, and he massaged them away while talking in that low, steady voice. "Pain doesn't make you stronger," he told the horse. "Healing does. Every time someone hurts you and you survive it, you think that makes you tough. But really, it just makes you scared. Real strength comes from knowing you're safe enough to be vulnerable, knowing someone won't take advantage when you let your guard down. That's what I'm offering you, boy. The chance to be vulnerable and discover it won't destroy you." By the fourth day, Diablo was following Silas around the property like a dog. Not because he'd been trained to, but because he wanted to. Because proximity to this human meant safety and comfort instead of pain and fear. Silas let him, never forcing the interaction, always giving the horse the choice to engage or withdraw. Sarah came to visit that afternoon and stopped in her tracks when she saw the stallion walking beside Silas to the garden, saw how the horse would stop when Silas stopped and start when he started. Perfect synchronization without any visible signals. "How did you do that?" she asked, amazed. "I didn't do anything," Silas replied. "I just let him be who he is, instead of trying to force him to be what I wanted. Turns out, what he is, naturally, is pretty close to what's needed anyway. Blackwood could never accomplish this in 100 years. Because Blackwood sees horses as tools to be shaped, I see them as partners to be understood. When you understand a creature, really understand what it needs and fears and wants, then working together becomes easy. It's not training so much as it is translation. On the 5th day, Silas introduced the idea of tack again, but so differently from Blackwood's approach that it barely resembled the same process. He let Diablo smell the saddle blanket, rub his face against it, investigate it thoroughly before ever placing it on the horse's back. When he finally did lay it across Diablo's spine, he did so with such slowness and care that the horse barely noticed the transition from exploring to wearing. The bridle took longer. Diablo had been hurt by the bit, and the memory was fresh and raw. Silas spent an hour just holding the bridle near the horse's face, letting him see it wasn't going to attack him. Then another hour gently touching the leather to Diablo's muzzle and cheeks, building positive associations. He didn't rush, didn't force, didn't get frustrated when the horse pulled away. He just kept offering the possibility that this thing could be different from what Diablo remembered, that not all bits had to hurt, that sometimes metal in the mouth could be gentle instead of cruel. By sunset on the 5th day, Diablo wore the bridle without fighting. He didn't like it, that was clear in the set of his ears and the tension in his jaw, but he trusted Silas enough to accept it. Trust was everything. Trust was the foundation on which every other accomplishment would be built. On the 6th day, Silas climbed into the saddle, not in one dramatic moment, but gradually, over hours, first just leaning across the horse's back, letting Diablo feel the weight and decide it was acceptable. Then one foot in the stirrup, weight shifting but not committing. Then both feet off the ground, balanced across the saddle but not seated. Each step waiting for the horse's permission, for the slight relaxation that meant he could continue. When Silas finally settled into the saddle properly, sitting upright with his hands resting lightly on the reins, Diablo stood perfectly still. No explosion, no bucking, no fight. Just a horse and a man, connected through leather and metal and something deeper that couldn't be named but could definitely be felt. "Good boy," Silas murmured. "That's my brave, strong, magnificent boy. You just did something amazing, you know that? You chose to trust, even though trust got you hurt before. That takes more courage than I've got words for." He dismounted after just a minute, not pushing his luck. That was enough for today. They'd built something important, something that couldn't be rushed or forced. Tomorrow was the demonstration, the moment when everything they'd worked toward would be tested in front of the entire town. But tonight, Silas could rest easy, knowing they'd done the real work. What happened tomorrow would simply be showing others what Diablo already understood, that kindness worked better than cruelty, always had and always would. As darkness fell, Silas sat on his porch one last time before the reckoning. Diablo grazed nearby, peaceful and calm. Patience stood beside him, the old mare and the young stallion, unlikely friends bound by shared space and gentle care. It was a simple scene, ordinary even, and that's exactly what made it extraordinary. Because 3 weeks ago, this horse had been a legend of wildness that no one could touch. Now he was just a horse, healing and whole, choosing connection over isolation. That was the miracle Silas had to show tomorrow. Not dominance or control, but partnership freely given. It would be enough. It had to be. The 7th day dawned clear and bright, the kind of morning that promised heat later but started with perfect coolness. Silas woke to find Diablo standing at his porch, the horse's head over the railing, watching through the window as if checking to make sure the old man was still there. When Silas emerged with his coffee, the stallion nickered a greeting, and something in that simple sound steadied Silas's nerves about what lay ahead. The demonstration was set for early afternoon in the town square, where there was room for everyone to gather and see. Blackwood had proposed the test himself. Both handlers would show their horses, responding to basic commands: walk, trot, stop, turn. Then they'd demonstrate mounting and riding. Finally, they'd show the horse's willingness to approach unfamiliar objects and handle unexpected situations. It was fair enough, Silas thought. It would show not just obedience but trust, not just training but true partnership. By noon, it seemed like everyone within 20 miles had arrived. The crowd was 3 times larger than the town's normal population. Word having spread about the contest between the old horse whisperer and the harsh horse breaker, people lined the streets, sat on rooftops, stood on wagons to get a better view, children perched on their fathers' shoulders. It felt like a carnival, except the air carried tension instead of celebration. Blackwood arrived first, leading a different horse, a young gelding he'd been working with since Diablo had proven too difficult. This was strategic, Silas realized. Blackwood was showing what his methods could accomplish with a more compliant animal, something that would perform reliably under pressure. The gelding moved with quick, nervous energy, obeying commands instantly, but showing tension in every line of his body. He was trained, certainly, but he looked miserable. Then Silas walked into the square with Diablo following loose at his shoulder. No rope, no halter, just a horse choosing to stay close to a human he trusted. The crowd's murmur rose to a roar of amazement. The legendary wild Stallion, walking calmly through the middle of town as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Mayor Hendricks, a stout man with impressive mutton chops, stood on a raised platform to officiate. "Gentlemen, we're here to settle a question that's divided this community. What's the better way to work with horses? Mr. Blackwood will demonstrate first." Blackwood put his gelding through the paces, and Silas had to admit the horse performed well. Commands were obeyed instantly, turns were sharp, stops were immediate. The mounting went smoothly, and Blackwood rode the horse through a series of maneuvers that showed the animal's training. When it came time for the obstacle portion, Blackwood led his mount past a flapping tarp, over a small jump, and between 2 narrow posts. The gelding did everything asked of him, though his ears stayed pinned back and his tail swished with obvious anxiety. The crowd applauded politely when Blackwood finished. It had been an impressive display of control, and no one could deny that the horse was obedient. Then it was Silas's turn. He stood in the center of the square with Diablo beside him, and for a moment he just let people look at them, this old man and this powerful horse, standing together in partnership rather than dominance. Then he began. He didn't shout commands or use dramatic gestures. He simply shifted his weight, turned his body, changed his focus, and the horse responded as if reading his thoughts. Walk, trot, stop, turn, all accomplished with nothing more than subtle body language and the occasional soft word. The crowd watched in wonder as man and horse moved together like 2 parts of one creature, so synchronized it was hard to tell who was leading and who was following. When it came time to mount, Silas did it slowly, giving Diablo every opportunity to object. The horse stood rock solid, his ears forward, his eye soft. Once mounted, Silas rode him through the same series of maneuvers Blackwood had shown, but where the gelding had moved with tense obedience, Diablo moved with calm confidence. His head was low and relaxed, his tail swinging gently, his whole demeanor one of a creature completely at ease with his partner. The obstacle course was where the real difference showed. Silas dismounted and walked toward the flapping tarp, knowing it would frighten most horses. Diablo followed him right up to it, sniffed it, then walked past it without hesitation, because he trusted that if Silas walked toward something, it must be safe. The same with the jump and the narrow passage. The horse followed where his partner led, not because he'd been forced to obey, but because he'd chosen to trust. When Silas finished, the crowd erupted. Not just applause, but cheering, people calling out his name and the horse's name, the sound rolling through the square like thunder. Silas stood there, with one hand on Diablo's neck, overwhelmed by the response, by what they'd accomplished together. Mayor Hendricks raised his hands for silence. "I think we've seen all we need to see. The question before us was, which method produces better results? Both horses were trained, both performed their tasks. But I'm going to ask you all to consider this. Which horse looked happy? Which horse seemed like he wanted to be there? Which partnership would you rather have for yourself? A voice called out from the crowd, surprisingly. It was one of Blackwood's own men, Tommy. Mr. Croft's way. That horse would follow him into fire. That's not training, that's love. Others echoed the sentiment. Not everyone, certainly some, still believed Blackwood's harsh methods were more practical, more efficient. But the majority had seen what Silas had seen, had recognized the difference between obedience enforced by fear and cooperation offered through trust. Mayor Hendricks looked at both men. "Mr. Blackwood, do you wish to concede, or shall we put it to a vote?" Blackwood stood there for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked over to where Silas stood with Diablo. He didn't speak at first, just looked at the stallion, really looked at him, seeing, perhaps for the first time, not a tool to be shaped, but a living being, with thoughts and feelings, and the capacity for connection. "I concede," Blackwood said finally, his voice rough. "Not because I think you won some contest, but because I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've never seen a horse look at a human the way that Stallion looks at you. I don't know if I can learn to do what you do, but I'm willing to try, if you're willing to teach me." The crowd went silent, shocked. This was not the ending anyone had expected, not victory and defeat, but transformation and possibility. Silas looked at Blackwood for a long moment, seeing past the pride and the bluster to something else, underneath a man who'd learned the wrong lessons early and had never questioned them until forced to. A man who could change, maybe, if given reason and guidance. "I'll teach you," Silas said simply. "Not because I think I'm better, but because every horse deserves a handler who sees them as more than property. Starting tomorrow, if you want, come by my place. We'll work together." Blackwood nodded, then walked away. His shoulders set, but his head slightly bowed. But through it all, Silas kept one hand on the stallion, anchoring himself in the simple reality of this connection they'd built. They'd won more than a contest today. They'd shown an entire community that another way was possible, that kindness could be strength, that patience could achieve what force never would. As the sun began to set and the crowd thinned, Sarah approached with tears in her eyes. "You did it," she said simply. "You changed everything." "No," Silas replied, looking at Diablo. "We did it. Me and this brave horse who decided to trust again, even after every reason not to. He's the real hero of this story." The stallion's ear swiveled toward his voice, listening, and Silas smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, teaching Blackwood, figuring out what came next, deciding what to do with a legend that had become simply a horse who needed a home. But tonight, standing in the fading light with a creature who'd chosen him as much as he'd chosen it, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt complete. 3 months later, Redemption Flats looked much the same as it always had, but something fundamental had shifted in its character. You could see it in small ways, in how people spoke to each other with slightly more patience, in how they handled their own animals with gentler hands, in how they approached problems with consideration instead of force. The change wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was real, and it was growing. Silas's cabin had become a place of pilgrimage for ranchers and horse handlers from surrounding territories. They came to watch him work, to ask questions, to learn the methods that had transformed a wild legend into a willing partner. He never charged for the lessons, though people often left money anyway, or goods, or offers of help with repairs to his aging buildings. The community had adopted him in a way they never had before, seeing him not as a relic of the past, but as a bridge to a better way of doing things. Cyrus Blackwood came 3 times a week without fail. The transformation in the man was remarkable. He'd sold off most of his harsh equipment, the heavy bits, the brutal spurs, the whips, and started rebuilding his business on principles Silas had taught him. It didn't come naturally to Blackwood. Years of doing things one way had carved deep grooves in his thinking, and learning to fill those grooves with patience instead of force was hard work. But he persisted, driven by what he'd seen that day in the town square, by the difference between a horse that obeyed out of fear and a horse that cooperated out of trust. His business had actually improved. Word spread that Blackwood had changed his ways, and the ranchers who'd pulled their contracts started coming back. The army fort sent a new buyer who'd heard about the gentle broke horses and wanted to see them for himself. He left with a string of 6 horses and a promise to return for more, paying premium prices for animals that were trained but not traumatized. "Never thought I'd say this," Blackwood admitted one afternoon while watching Silas work with a young mare, "but you were right. About all of it. These horses are better, calmer, smarter, more reliable. And the work's actually easier this way. Once you get the hang of it. Takes longer, sure, but you don't spend half your time fighting with animals that hate you." Silas smiled slightly. "That's the thing people don't understand. They think gentle means soft, means you're not accomplishing anything. But gentle is just another word for efficient. Why fight when you can cooperate? Why force when you can ask? The horse does what you want either way, but one way he wants to do it and one way he's just scared not to. The end result looks the same to folks who don't know horses, but any horseman worth his salt can see the difference." Diablo had become famous in ways that transcended his old legend. Before, he'd been the wild stallion no one could catch, a symbol of untamed freedom. Now he was something more complex and more interesting, a symbol of healing, of transformation, of the possibility that even the most damaged creatures could learn to trust again if given proper care. Children asked to visit him, artists came to paint him. A writer from the Denver newspaper spent 3 days in town gathering material for an article about the horse whisperer and the stallion that changed a community's mind. Silas kept Diablo, in the end. He'd offered the horse his freedom once the demonstration was over, rode him out to the edge of the mountains, dismounted, and removed all his tack. Told him he was free to go, to return to the wild if that's what he wanted. Diablo had walked maybe 30 feet away, looked back, then returned to stand beside Silas with his head resting on the old man's shoulder. The message was clear. This was where he wanted to be. Freedom wasn't about wide spaces and being untouched. Freedom was about choosing your own bonds, and Diablo had chosen Silas. The two of them, along with old Patience, formed an unusual little herd. The mare had taken on the role of auntie, teaching the stallion the finer points of domestic life, showing him how to respond to Silas's moods, how to read the weather, how to find the best grass in the meadow. It was peaceful in a way Silas had thought he'd never experience again after Margaret died, not the same as human companionship, but valuable in its own way. Sarah Henley had become a regular visitor, and somewhere along the way the visits had shifted from professional interest to something more personal. They were both too old to rush into anything, too aware of life's fragility to make assumptions about the future. But there was companionship there, and affection, and the possibility that neither of them had to be alone if they didn't want to be. It was enough for now, more than enough. On a cool evening in late autumn, Silas sat on his porch with coffee and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The horses grazed nearby, their coats growing thick for winter. Smoke rose from chimneys in town, families settling in for the evening. Everything was ordinary and peaceful and exactly as it should be. He thought about that day 3 months ago when a wild stallion had run through town and he'd made the choice to step forward instead of back. It felt like a lifetime ago and also like yesterday. Everything had changed from that one decision, not just for him, not just for the horse, but for an entire community that had been forced to question assumptions they'd held about strength and control and the right way to treat creatures weaker than themselves. Margaret would have loved seeing how it all turned out. She'd always believed in the power of one person doing one right thing, the ripples spreading outward in ways you couldn't predict. She'd been right about that, like she'd been right about so many things. Silas wished he could tell her about it, wished he could share this sunset with her, this peace, this sense of having accomplished something that mattered. But maybe, in some way he didn't fully understand, she knew. Maybe that's what the last 15 years had been about, learning to live with her absence, but not without her influence, carrying forward the lessons she'd taught him about patience and kindness, and never giving up on things just because they seemed impossible. Diablo walked over to the porch and rested his head on the railing, his dark eyes reflecting the sunset colors. Silas reached out and scratched behind the stallion's ears, feeling the solid warmth of living flesh, the trust that flowed between them now as naturally as breath. "You know what I've learned from you?" Silas said quietly to the horse. "I've learned that it's never too late. Never too late to change, never too late to heal, never too late to choose a different path than the one you've been walking. I thought my useful days were behind me, thought all I had left was to wait around for the end, but you showed me different. You showed me that sometimes the most important work of your life comes when you least expect it, when you think you're too old or too tired or too broken to matter anymore." The horse blew out softly through his nostrils, a sound of contentment. In the meadow, Patience raised her head and nickered, calling them to come down and graze before full darkness fell. It was time for the evening routine: fresh water, checking the fences, making sure everyone was settled for the night. Silas stood up slowly, his old bones protesting, and Diablo backed away from the porch to give him room. Together they walked toward the lean-to, man and horse moving in synchronization, built from months of careful attention to each other's rhythms. Behind them, the last light faded from the sky, and stars began to emerge one by one. In the town below, lamps were being lit in windows, children were being called in from play, doors were closing against the cooling night air. Life continued in its ordinary patterns, unremarkable and essential. But woven through that ordinariness now was something new, a story about courage and compassion that would be told and retold, that would shape how people thought about strength and gentleness, that would remind them in dark moments that change was always possible if you had the courage to stand still when everyone else ran, to reach out when everyone else pulled back, to believe that kindness could triumph even when all evidence suggested otherwise. That was Silas's legacy now. Not just a horse saved, but a community transformed. Not just a skill demonstrated, but a philosophy proven. And on quiet evenings, when he sat on his porch watching the sunset, he felt the weight of that legacy not as a burden but as a gift, the knowledge that his life had mattered, that his choices had changed things for the better, that when he was gone, people would remember not just what he'd done, but what he'd shown them was possible. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything. As darkness settled over the valley and the horses settled into sleep, Silas stood for one more moment under the stars, feeling the immensity of the sky above and the solidity of the earth below, grateful for the unexpected grace that had brought an old man and a wild horse together to teach each other about trust and healing, and the quiet courage required to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday, if you were just willing to do the work. Then he turned and walked inside, closing the door gently behind him, leaving the night to the horses and the stars and the soft wind moving through the pines. Another day done. Another small victory for gentleness in a world that too often confused strength with force. Another step toward becoming the kind of person, the kind of community that chose compassion over cruelty whenever given the choice. It was a good way to live. It was the only way worth living. And as Silas lay down to sleep with the sound of horses breathing in the darkness outside his window, he knew with absolute certainty that Margaret would have approved of how he'd spent these last 3 months, of the man he was becoming in his old age, of the legacy he was building, not through grand gestures, but through patient, persistent kindness, offered one day, one horse, one moment at a time. That was the lesson, that was the gift, that was the truth that would outlast them all. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't drawing your gun, it's keeping it holstered. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stand still and offer an open hand to a frightened creature, trusting that trust itself is enough to change the world.